And Sherry, I think, Sherry, you need to unmute.
I think I did it. Okay.
Okay.
Good evening. Thanks for being a part of this webinar. Let's begin with prayer. Gracious God, thank you for the opportunity for us to gather this evening to learn about hunger and climate change. Thank you for the leaders in our church calling us to be stewards of creation and to continue to work for a just world and climate where all are fed. Thank you, Lord, for your amazing, powerful creation, which continues to surround us with beauty and life-giving energy. Thank you for ears to listen, hearts to care, hands to act with compassion. Be with us during this webinar. Strengthen us for the challenges that which lie ahead. Empower us to use our gifts to work for justice and to be your gracious people, making a difference today for tomorrow. We give thanks in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Our presenter this evening is Ryan Cumming. Ryan is Program Director for Hunger Education for ELCA World Hunger. In this role, he directs the development of ELCA World Hunger's educational resources, researches trends in hunger and poverty, and assists with communications with partners and with congregations. Ryan is a graduate of Capital University and Loyola University in Chicago, where he received a Ph.D. in Theology with a focus on Christian ethics. He's the author of the African American Challenge to Just War Theory and contributor to and editor of the 3-volume Forgotten Luther series with Fortress Press. Before working for ELCA World Hunger, Ryan was interim editor of the Journal of Lutheran Ethics and a member of the ELCA's task force on criminal justice. He lives with his wife and children in Chelsea, Michigan. Ryan, we welcome you.
Thank you very much, Eric, and my thanks to your team for this invitation, for planning this whole event. So hats off to all of you for the hard work of bringing this all together. And again, many thanks for the invitation. I bring you greetings, of course, from our ELCA World Hunger team and from Lutheran Disaster Response, which is now part of our team within the ELCA churchwide organization, some of whom are here and joining us this evening. I want to introduce briefly my colleague, Brooke DeYoung, who is the program assistant for Hunger Education. Brooke's going to help with letting people in from the waiting room and also monitoring the chat, posting links, and keeping an eye out for questions and comments that you can type into the chat while I'm presenting. Unfortunately, given the realities of Zoom, I can't see the chat while I'm presenting, so she's going to help with that. But if you do have a question, feel free to type it in there. We're going to try to save some time at the end for your questions and some conversation. But thank you again to all of you for being here this evening, and especially to the team that put this together. One of the stories I want to open up with to just share a little bit about involves my kids. We've been, ever since the pandemic started, we've been exploring kind of the wilds around Chelsea, Michigan, where I live. We're fortunate to be surrounded by a variety of lakes and nature walks and preserves and metro parks and state game areas. And during the pandemic, we found those to be incredibly welcome places to spend our time in. It's been a growing experience for my son. My son, Neil, is 11 years old, was born in Chicago and lived there until he was 7 years old. And the reason I say it was kind of a growing experience for him is when one of the really curious things about Neil when he was just a little boy is if he walked barefoot on grass, it was like he was walking on glass. he would put his foot on the grass and he'd pull it right back and get right back on the sidewalk. And he's very much a city kid. You get him on sidewalk or on a street, take off like a shot. Put him on grass, he didn't quite know what to do. Now he's gotten a little bit more comfortable with it. We've gone from living in Chicago in the city and watching for broken glass on the sidewalk to now watching for things like ticks and mosquitoes. And he's learned to adapt a bit. But the reason I share that story is to open us up as we're thinking about climate change and thinking about the environment, to think about what it is we're really talking about. And when we're talking about the environment, we're not just talking about kind of the plants, the flora and fauna that surround us. We're not talking just about the science behind climate change. What we're talking about is this context that really shapes who we are. We are fundamentally contextual creatures. And we know that even from the witness of Scripture. The story of creation opens with the rich description of a place. The Exodus is a story of a people, sure, but it's a story of a people journeying to a place where they will become who they are supposed to be. Even the book of Revelations is, again, a rich description of a place. The environment shapes who we are in profound ways. And so when it comes to questions of climate change or questions of environmental stewardship, these get at some of our deepest values and our deepest sense of self. Of course, we know what we know from the science that lies behind climate change is that these places are changing, right? This environment that's part of our identity, this environment that's part of our context is changing, and it's not changing for the better. One of the clearest indicators, and the first indicator, is global temperature, which has increased more than 2 degrees Fahrenheit on average since the late 1800s, with most of that coming in the last 40 years, according to NASA. Now, if that seems like not a small amount, we have to remember that it was only a couple of degrees change in average temperature that contributed to ice ages in prehistoric times. We can also look at other evidence, ice sheets, for example. In Greenland, the ice sheet in Greenland has lost about 279 billion tons of ice per year between 1993 and 2019. You can see the graph there of the mass loss in metric tons across Greenland. In Antarctica, the loss was about 148 billion tons per year during the same period, again 1993 to about 2019. The Great Lakes, our own region here, you can see the animated chart on the left, kind of moving through the average ice cover, maximum ice cover, over the periods from 1970s into 2020. The Great Lakes have been hit particularly hard, warming faster than the average air temperature in recent years. Summer temps on Lake Superior have increased 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit from 1979 to 2006. At the same time, ice coverage has declined significantly. Annual average ice coverage of the Great Lakes has declined 71% between 1973 and 2019, according to researchers at the University of Michigan. Lake Ontario and Lake Superior were particularly hard hit. They had the greatest losses. Lake Ontario was down about 88%. These increased temperatures within the lakes have driven species of fish further north. They've increased algae blooms. They've had a significant impact on evaporation from the lakes and thus precipitation, not to mention coastal erosion around the lakes. The temperatures are increasing rapidly enough that some researchers estimate that summers in Michigan may start to feel more like Arkansas or Missouri by mid-century. But we don't need to hear just from scientists in Ann Arbor or East Lansing to know that things are changing. The Midwest International Racing Association is finding it increasingly difficult to find places to host snowmobile races and other winter activities. These activities depend not on snow, but on ice. And in order for that ice to develop, we need days where the high temperatures don't exceed freezing. And yet, these days are projected to decrease in frequency by anywhere from 31 to 56 days per year by 2080. That means over the course of the next 60 or so years, we'll see 1 to 2 months fewer days where the high temperature doesn't exceed freezing. Looking at these trends led the author of the Free Press article to write, "Michigan winters, as generations have known them and relied on them, as many of us have known them and relied on them, appear to be coming to an end." We don't need to be reminded either what a blow this would be, not just to our recreational habits, but really to our economy. Michigan winter recreational activities is a $3 billion a year industry, and that's not even counting things like ice fishing. In fact, by 2070, Michigan is not alone in this. By 2070, 162 million people in the US will experience a decline in the quality of their environment, principally because of increased heat and less water. 162 million people, nearly 1 in 2 in the US. And we used to call these trends global warming, right? We all remember that term, global warming. But the reason we've shifted to the term of climate change is that the notion of global warming doesn't fully capture the extent of the changes that we're seeing. It's heat, sure, but it's also variations in precipitation. It's variations in soil moisture levels. It's increased storm severity and more. Of course, one of the rejoinders that we often hear from people who are resistant to action against climate change is that this is just natural, that this is part of what the world does. So, we ask the question, are climatic changes like this natural? Well, yeah, to some extent, climatic changes can be natural. The last one was about 3 million years ago when we had close to the CO2 levels in the atmosphere that we have now. The Earth was about 2 to 3 degrees Celsius warmer. The sea level was 50 to 80 feet higher. And Antarctica, by most estimates, was practically forest land. So yes, these cycles happen. They're natural, but they're not good. And we know that what's happening now is very far from natural. And we know that because we can measure the types of isotopes of carbon dioxide that are frozen in ice. And so we know where it's coming from. It's an isotope that's particularly linked to one thing, fossil fuels. We know that what is happening is not one of these natural cycles. And even if it were, we know that that natural cycle would be incredibly destructive. The effects of this are enormous and much farther reaching than winter sports or recreation. The environment is not just where we play, but it's where we work and it's where our food is produced. The impact of climate change on hunger is already significant and has the potential to become incredibly severe in the coming years. This is one of the reasons that ELCA World Hunger takes climate change so seriously and invests in so many projects that are related to building climate change resilience, mitigation, and adaptation. As our partner organization, Bread for the World, noted in a recent report, we've made tremendous progress against global hunger in the last 30 years. We've developed more efficient food delivery systems. We've seen unprecedented economic growth, particularly throughout Asia. We've invested in healthcare to combat many of the diseases and illnesses that keep people in poverty and hunger. And we've expanded educational and vocational programs around the world to bring hunger down by more than 30% since 1990. But we've done all that and not really addressed climate. And the combined effects of climate change now threaten to undo most of that work in barely more time than it took to make that progress. Currently, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations estimates that about 29 million people are hungry because of climate change. Now, they're taking into account people who are impacted by climate shocks like sudden storms or droughts, as well as people who found that the areas they live in are no longer hospitable to traditional crops. As we've addressed hunger and not addressed climate change, we can also say that some of the ways that we've tried to address hunger have been inimical to addressing climate change, particularly through the shipment of food or the introduction of crops that are not well suited to areas around the world. Because we aren't addressing this, not only will we reverse the trends of declines in hunger and poverty that we've seen, but again, we're going to move into a state of regression. Climate change, according to the World Bank, may drive an additional 68 to 132 million people into poverty by 2030. I'm going to repeat that again. An additional 68 to 132 million people into poverty by the end of this decade. Currently, we're already seeing some of the impacts of climate change, of course. You can see the pictures there of the drought in Brazil. The picture on the left from June 2019 at the beginnings of the drought, and from June of 2021, this year. And you can see the difference, not only in the availability of water, but in the vegetation that are surrounding these watersheds. We also know that more than 1 million people right now, more than 1 million people are facing catastrophic levels of hunger in Madagascar because of drought. As the head of the World Food Program recently pointed out in his quote, it is drought, it is climate change, it is drought upon drought upon drought. There is no other explanation. They have faced drought, they have faced extreme heat events, all of which has contributed to near famine levels of hunger for people within southern Madagascar. In fact, there's an alarming number of countries right now that are facing near famine or famine risk just in 2021, many of which are because of the impacts of climate change. We know that it's a case of climate change and hunger are tied together, but what are some of the ways in which that bears out? How is it that climate change impacts hunger? Well, there's 4 kinds of categories of ways that climate change impact hunger. The first we've already talked about a little bit. That's food availability. What is produced? What food is available for people to consume? And principally here, we're talking about floods, droughts, and storms that can impact food production. Droughts internationally account for about 80% of agricultural losses. The US, even without a pure drought, rising temps are putting plants at risk. For example, perennial crops in the US have a chilling requirement, which means a certain number of hours with a temperature between 10 degrees Celsius and 0 degrees Celsius that they need in order to winter over successfully and germinate in the next season. Generally, this is anywhere from 200 to 2,000 hours. Unfortunately, because of the increased temperatures in many areas in the country, they're not getting that. The USDA suggests that these rising temps may prevent fruit and nut trees in California from meeting their chilling requirement by the middle to the end of this century. You can imagine the impact of that if fruit and nut trees within California are no longer agriculturally viable. And it's not just plants. Animals too require cooler nights to recover from daytime heat. In the South and Southwest, this is becoming less frequent, which places stress on cattle and other livestock. In addition, with the increased temperatures, the more days with 100-degree weather, the fewer nights where the temperature is dropping, what we're starting to see in other regions of the country are widespread pests and widespread disease that were not usually found in these regions. So for instance, with the rising temperatures in the Midwest and the Great Lakes region, we may see more favorable conditions for things like anthrax. Or as I mentioned with my son, just in our own lives, when I was a kid, we went out and about all over Macomb County, into the parks, crawling through the Clinton River to catch frogs and things like that. Never once heard of a tick. Now, they're a regular problem that we have to watch for. Every time that our kids go outside, they come back in and we check them for ticks. These pests were relatively rare in Michigan for most of the time during my childhood in the 1980s. They've become increasingly present within the state, in part because of warming temperatures and warmer winters that are making the environment more favorable to them. This will impact agriculture as well. In Michigan, there's kind of 2 effects that have happened there. Not only the warmer temperatures preventing the chilliness necessary for plants and animals, but one of the first effects is a longer growing season, but a wetter one. Most of us have heard the stories from farmers trying to get their crops into the fields and simply can't because the ground is too wet. It makes it more difficult to meet the demands of the growing season. And the second, like we saw this year, are false springs, where we have periods of heat within the spring followed by another often unexpected freeze or frost. In 2012, the state of Michigan lost 90% of our tart cherry crops statewide because of one of these false springs. Estimates suggest that these conditions could lead to a reduction in our corn and soybean yields in the state of Michigan of anywhere from 10 to 30% by 2050. So food availability is one way that climate change impacts hunger. The second is food access. How do we get our food? Well, with climate change, obviously, we're going to face increased poverty from threats to livelihoods that are tied to agriculture or tied to the climate, followed by price spikes after climate-related crises due to low supply. The other piece with food access are market and road closures from climate events, which particularly impact people who are living in poverty, who often don't have improved infrastructure to be able to withstand large climatic events. To some extent, we see these kinds of problems in the United States as well, but we also have robust subsidies and insurance programs that kind of tend to mask it a little bit more than we might find in other countries. The third category is food utilization or storage. What kinds of foods do we eat and what kinds of foods do we keep? With climate change, what we're going to see is a reduced quality and diversity due to high prices. People simply can't afford the variety of foods that would contribute to a healthy diet. We'll also see less safety in food. Rainfall, for instance, encourages mold growth in food stores. Heat, on the other hand, encourages risks of salmonella and other types of bacteria. And the last category is stability, and this is the one that I want to focus a little bit more attention on. But stability is the context in which we eat. What's likely to happen with increased climate change is also increased migration as people move from areas that are not either hospitable for living or for working or for agriculture into cities and into other areas, while also looking at a high risk of an increased severity of illnesses, some things we may not think about. So, for example, kidney disease in arid regions, or heat stroke, which is becoming an increasing issue in the American Southwest. Along with stability are changes in livelihoods and scarcity of resources that can trigger volatility and conflict. In Michigan, per Michigan State University, as I mentioned about the increase in ticks and the increase in illnesses, Lyme disease in the state of Michigan increased 5-fold between 2000 and 2014. Again, this was a relatively rare disease in Michigan, even as much as 2 to 3 decades ago. But now it's something that's become more significant and will continue to be as conditions become more favorable to different forms of pests or different bacteria. As I said, I want to focus a little bit more on this issue of stability, particularly with migration. Now, migration and climate change are interesting because they both function kind of cyclically with poverty and hunger. Now, climate change on its own can contribute to hunger through some of the other categories that I mentioned there. But migration on its own can also contribute to hunger, in part by separating people from families or social support systems, or by separating them from access to jobs or livelihoods or education. So they work in a little bit in tandem, which can create a sort of perfect storm for poverty and hunger. I don't want to overstate the impact of climate change on migration. Conflict and economic downturns remain the primary drivers of migration, but climate change is a significant factor that we may see grow in the years to come. In fact, the World Bank estimates that it will be a primary reason for about 140 million people to migrate around the world by 2050. We see this already to some extent, particularly within countries where people are forced to leave homes and farms to find work elsewhere, especially in cities that often lack the infrastructure to support the influx of new people, which can be further destabilizing. So we have climate change that destabilizes livelihoods and safety, leading to migration. Migration then destabilizes infrastructure because it puts strains on infrastructure and availability of jobs in other areas, which then increases volatility and conflict. And so you see this kind of pernicious cycle that climate change is right in the very center of. In the United States, climate migration is already happening. It just may not get talked about as much as it ought to be. On the left there in the bayou, you see a place in Louisiana called Ile de Jean Charles. Ile de Jean Charles is home to an American Indian community and has been since the 1800s, the Choctaw predominantly. Ile de Jean Charles is currently sinking into the bayou for 2 reasons. The first is because of rising sea levels around the delta. And the second is because of the extraction of oil from the bayou. They were the first community in the United States to basically be paid to leave, paid to flee that area and to move closer into the mainland where they would be safe. There's one road that goes down to Ile de Jean Charles, and that road, with even a minor storm, can be closed for months at a time, leaving the area inaccessible except by boat. So Ile de Jean Charles is one of the areas we're already seeing the impact of climate migration. The second is in the picture that is on the right there of the house kind of falling onto the beach there. That's from a place called Shishmaref, Alaska. Shishmaref is on a barrier island and Alaska. And it's losing, I believe at the last time I saw, was about 12 feet of coastline per year. And we actually have an ELCA church there called Shishmaref Lutheran Church. Again, this is American Indian and Alaska Native community. And they actually had a vote whether or not to stay on the barrier island that they've been on for generations. And the vote turned out to leave because the island is sinking into the sea. Part of the reason that's happening is because the sea around them no longer is freezing. That ice, as we know from places like Lake Michigan, Huron, Superior, that ice protects the coastline. And without that, winter storms raging through the sea are tearing the island into the water. So we're already starting to see climate migration within the United States. But of course, these aren't the first examples, right? The Dust Bowl in the 1930s was one of the earliest examples of what might be interpreted as climactic migration. The Dust Bowl, as we may remember from high school studying The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, the Dust Bowl was a series of droughts in the 1930s. These droughts throughout the Plains states exacerbated the lingering economic effects of the Great Depression, ultimately driving about 2 to 2.5 million people west. It was one of the earliest mass climate migrations in the US. Of course, as the people migrated, they weren't welcome. States like Colorado tried to steal their borders to migrants. California relegated them to shanty towns. And throughout the places they went, they were referred to by the derogatory term of Okie. One of the things that we don't hear as much about is that the Dust Bowl itself was not accidental. It wasn't just drought that led to these conditions. You see, as the settlers moved in, taking advantage of the Homestead Act by being able to secure land in these states, they plowed up native prairie grasses and planted things like corn, wheat, and cotton. Those are thirsty crops. Now, this had two effects. The first is that it made their livelihood very sensitive to drought. So in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Missouri, their yields of crops dropped about 60% between 1924 and 1934. And the second effect, by removing the prairie grasses, they left the land vulnerable to wind erosion. So you had these massive dust storms, like in this previous picture, that eroded topsoil, destroyed crops and homes, and forced people to flee. 80 years later, the Dust Bowl shantytowns still have slower economic growth, and the survivors and their descendants tend to have higher rates of poverty. Now, this could be because many of them were already poor to begin with, but certainly the experience in the Dust Bowl prevented any kind of economic mobility that may have happened as they gained access to land by moving to the central states. The scary thing is not that this happened in the past, though, but that it could happen again in the future, particularly as the American South begins to heat up. In terms of what might drive some modern climate migration, the first driver will be heat. By the year 2100, the end of this century, 100-degree days may become the norm in the Southwest, turning heat waves that now are survivable, even if they're difficult to get through, into debilitating health crises, and making agricultural work not only more costly, but in some areas of the country, utterly unsustainable. The other driver is access to water. By 2040, estimates suggest that water shortages could be near constant west of Missouri. We know now, this year alone, about 28% or so of the American West is under drought. The third is rising sea levels, which could force as many as 13 people to flee coastlines for safer and more livable conditions in central states or in cities. Well, what can we learn? What can we learn from the Dust Bowl and other migration events that might prepare us for this modern migration that may happen by the end of this century? Well, first thing we can learn is that mass migration is disruptive. And I mean this descriptively, not evaluatively, but it's disruptive. And it can contribute in many ways to greater and more entrenched poverty. If we think about who leaves when people migrate, especially when people migrate in mass, who leaves, it's not generally the people who are the poorest of the poor. Those people in deep entrenched poverty often can't afford to leave. And so they're left behind. And they happen to be the people who are at greater risk of negative outcomes from climactic events. So what we may see is mass migration into cities throughout the American West and into the North, cities, again, that are ill-equipped with their infrastructure to handle that. And then also deeper and more entrenched poverty within the American South and Southwest. The second thing that we can learn from the Dust Bowl and from other migratory events is that long-term thinking can help prevent crises. Again, the Dust Bowl, just as one example, was not accidental. Had there been longer term thinking in terms of what crops would work best in those states and in those areas, then the crisis of the dust storms that was caused or precipitated by the drought may have been prevented. And the third thing that we can learn, and this is a little bit different, is that the land matters. When we think back to those stories of the Dust Bowl, those pictures, like some of the pictures we just saw, or as I mentioned, Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath, one of the things we hear over and over again, people don't want to leave. People don't want to leave. We even see this in migration studies from the Dust Bowl. Many farmers stayed. It was their land. And I think if we're going to address climate change, if we're going to be serious about talking about the environment, and what it means to be stewards of the land that we've been gifted with, we have to understand this depth of significance, value, and identity, both in terms of the land itself and in terms of activity that happens on that land. When we're talking about climate, we're not just talking about science, as I'll describe more in a little bit. We're not just talking about science. We're not just talking about the plants and animals or the soil and moisture levels around us. We're talking about things that are deeply part of who we are, individually, generationally, and collectively. And that's one of the things that we have to keep in mind if we're going to address climate change in any real sort of way. So what can we do? Given these realities, given the forecasts that we have for the way climate change will impact us as communities, will impact our ability to access, to utilize, and to grow food and produce food, what can we do? Well, the first thing before I get into any of the bullet points that are on here is I wanted to say we need to be buoyed by hope. Again, turning to the Bread for the World report that I mentioned a moment ago, they have this wonderful quote, and I think that this is an important lesson for us to take away from the COVID-19 pandemic. They write, "The pandemic has proven that when necessary, people by the billions are capable of quickly changing their behavior, offering hope that by the same token, people can build food systems and wider economic systems that are more equitable and sustainable." And I think that we have to take that seriously and be buoyed by hope as we respond. The first thing that we can do as a church and as individuals is learn from what's already being done. As I mentioned, one of the ways that our church responds to climate change, both in the United States and around the world, is through ELCA World Hunger and through Lutheran Disaster Response. The picture that you see here is a picture of workers in El Salvador in a project that ELCA World Hunger supports, who are working in the Jiboa River. What this community is working on is restoration of the river basin. They depend on that river for drinking, for cooking, for bathing, for irrigation. And the river and the aquifers in their area are unsafe and unclean, which leads to higher risk for bacterial and waterborne diseases, right? Both for themselves and for their animals. And so they're engaged in a project with the Lutheran Church in El Salvador to restore these water basins by working together, educating people in the community about the importance of the water, educating about effective ways of responding to water that's unsafe or unclean. But they're also doing something else that's really important, I think, that we can learn from as well. They're not only engaging with people in the community, they're working with businesses and governments in cities and villages up and down the river, all throughout the aquifer, to work together because they know they can't do it alone. And that leads to the second thing that we have to do, which is advocate and partner. Learning from them, we realize it's not just one community that can work together. We have to get past the delusion that we can that we can do this on our own and be successful. We have to advocate. Much of what climate change is, much of the vulnerabilities that are tied to climate change are issues of policy. Climate change at its root is a justice issue. And that requires justice-seeking policies and advocacy that shape the way that we live within our environment. I'll give you just one example of a policy and the way that policy can impact climate change. One of the top 10 producers of cotton within the United States is the state of Arizona, which may sound a little bit surprising. If you know much about the cotton crop, it requires a great deal of water to grow. And one thing you don't have if you're a farmer in Arizona is a great deal of water. And yet cotton remains a predominant crop throughout the state of Arizona. Why? Part of that has to do with the way that subsidies and insurance are meted out for farmers of cotton within the state of Arizona. Through the US Farm Bill, the government effectively pays farmers in Arizona to continue growing cotton. They'll even pay their premiums on their insurance for their crops and for their farms. They'll pay them to plant cottonseed each season. And the farmers themselves even know that this is not the best crop for this region. It's not going to grow well. But they also know that the amount of money that they get through subsidies and through insurance payouts far exceeds what they might get from other sorts of crops. And so in this way, what we see is a policy that effectively is paying farmers to plant something that the farmers don't want to plant and ought not to be planting in the first place. So changing those types of policies that intersect with climate change is going to be critical if we're going to make large-scale kinds of movements that we need in order to prevent the worst forecasts from becoming reality. And the way we can invest in change is to invest in sustainable food systems. If there was another lesson that came out of the pandemic, it was just how fragile our food system was. We saw that when COVID hit processing factories for things like chicken and beef, immediately we saw shortages in stores that weren't just because people were buying too much. It wasn't just hoarding. It was because there were bottlenecks within the supply chain. The food system that we have created, largely with the corporatization of food production, has created a very fragile system. And we saw that already just last year. One of the ways that we can respond to climate change is to protect farmers for the long haul by helping them pay for mitigation that they'll need to protect crops and livestock, but also by investing in what they're doing in the local level, creating more pathways between farms and tables, creating different models of markets and different models of farming that enable us to have a more sustainable food system and enable us to invest in the very people that we are hoping will benefit from these changes, the people who produce our food. One of the other things that we can do that's really critically important is to build power. In the picture there, you see a man from Malawi. That's Mr. Moses January there on the left. Mr. Moses January grew up an orphan, has lived in poverty most of his life in Malawi, and used to have to rely on the charity of neighbors in his community in order to get by, to feed himself, his 3 children, and the 4 orphans that his family takes care of. Through the Lutheran Church and Evangelical Lutheran Development Services in Malawi, Mr. Moses was able to take part in a training of trainers on sustainable agricultural practices. Because of that, he learned about different ways of using water, ways to grow crops, how to have a successful plot of land and a farm. But he also got access to capital through a village savings and loan program. Village savings and loan program, the people within the community pool their money together, give loans to each other, which they then pay back with a small amount of interest into the village savings and loan, so that other people can use that capital to grow, to expand their farms, to access seeds or tools or other inputs for their crops. These VSLs are especially important in areas like the Mr. Moses' community in Malawi, because many times farmers like that are not able to access traditional means of lending or traditional pathways to capital. They don't have the power to be able to make the kind of changes that need to be made. By participating in this program, Mr. Moses was able not only to access the power of capital, but the power of training and the power of knowledge. He became eventually a trainer in his own community. And so instead of being someone who relied on the charity of other people, he was able to build up his own farm and now raises not only vegetables, but also chickens and goats. And he spends his free time training other people to access that kind of power as well, and investing in people so that they can make meaningful decisions about their land and about their own lives is critical to addressing climate change and to addressing environmental threats more broadly. Dorcetta Taylor, a researcher who looks at environmental threats within urban areas, particularly within the US, had a very interesting results of the studies that she did. One of the things that she mentions is that when we look at communities that are particularly at risk for environmental disasters or environmental health threats, she said the thing that is most closely predictive of their ability to withstand or to successfully move past environmental health threats is not race, it's not class, it's not location, it's power. It's whether or not that community is organized with a collective voice and has power to be able to leverage to ensure that authorities, including business and governmental authorities, are taking the steps necessary to ensure that they're protected. Again, climate change is not just a matter of science, it's a matter of justice, and thus it's a matter of power. Building power by investing in communities, particularly communities that are at higher risk, is critical to addressing this. And lastly, if we're going to address climate change, we need to be about the business of recovering values and vision. Climate change is not just about science. It's about values and it's about identity. It's why Senator Inhofe can make a more powerful argument by holding a snowball on the floor of Congress than he could by holding up a series of charts with statistics. Because when it comes to the environment, it is about who we are and the things that we believe in. We don't encounter the environment as a bare field of facts and data. My most significant experience with water is not learning about hydrology or testing its pH level, but diving in to Lake Sapphire in Lake City, fishing for walleye in Lake Erie, or watching Tequamanon Falls during sunrise. The environment is the context in which we become who we are. Treating it as no more than a field of scientific study will miss this point. To get at this recovery, we need to provide space for telling our stories and from learning from other people about theirs. This involves also recovering a sense of spirituality about the environment, looking at individual actions, things as simple as a river cleanup or a recycling day, as spiritual actions that can form us to be the kind of people in our environmental context that we are called to be. It also means recovering a sense of who we are in relation to God. One of the mantras of people who moved west and became victims of the Dust Bowl was that rain would follow the plow. That if they just fought hard enough against the land, they could conquer it and God would bless them with the rain that they needed to grow their crops. That didn't happen because we don't work that way and God doesn't work that way. And the environment doesn't work that way. We aren't made to be masters of universes. We're made to be in relationship with the land. And when the land is unhealthy, when it is unfruitful, that's a sign that there is something amiss in our relationship to it and our relationship to God. We need a deep theological vision that allows us to recover a sense of that relationality between ourselves, God, and the environment. And a theological vision that allows us to recover a sense of the holy in the presence of creation. That's at the crux of who we are as Lutherans. As Lutherans, our ethics is not based on following rules, whether it's the rule of God or the rules of science, nor is it based merely on heroically solving problems. It's based on a promise that we are invited by God to see the holy in the midst of the ordinary, to live in gratitude, and to be co-creators with God as God is doing the work of bringing the promise of the full reconciliation of the earth into being. Recovering a sense of the holy helps us to see the environment as not as a weighty field of responsibility, nor merely as a tool for humans to exploit, but as a sphere of never-ending opportunity to encounter God. A place where we can live out and recover a sense of our own vocation as participants in the creation and the reconciliation that God is working in our midst. I'll finish by telling you a story to highlight this. I was talking to an elderly gentleman that I know who was incredibly resistant to climate change, really didn't believe that it existed or that we really needed to do much about it. I would try to share with him when we would talk about it, because we love to debate. We would try to share with him some of the science and the data points, like some of the things I shared today. And he would kind of chuckle and push back on them, or sometimes not chuckle and get a little bit angry and push back on them. You know what finally broke through, though, in the conversation? He was sharing with me about when he was growing up going walleye fishing in the Great Lakes and whitefish fishing in the Great Lakes, and talking about how much he he desired how much he was looking forward to taking his young grandson out on the lakes to go fishing for whitefish and walleye. What finally brought home the reality of climate change to him was not numbers about the temperatures of the water, not surface temps, ice coverage charts, or things like that, but the question, what are you going to do when those fish are no longer there? When that piece of the environment that is so part of who you are and part of your history is no longer a real possibility. Those kinds of questions and those kinds of stories, those kinds of memories, those dangerous memories of who we are. And I call them dangerous because they can upset and disrupt our normal ways of interacting with the environment or understanding it. Those are so important to recover. If we're going to respond to climate change, we need the science, we need the information, but we also need this recovery of values and a vision about who we are becoming and the context in which that's happening. We can do this together as church. We already are, as I mentioned, through ministries like ELCA World Hunger and Lutheran Disaster Response, but also through synodical ministries and congregational ministries that are taking steps to address climate change and to protect the environment in their own midst. We have two things I just want to mention quickly here. The first is a new resource that will be coming out very soon, probably within the next month. It's in design right now, and that's a Climate and Hunger Toolkit, which is a series of easy activities that you can use with a small group or with your congregation to walk through some of these questions about environmental stewardship, climate change, and who we are called to be as stewards of creation. The second is something I'm really excited about. This is a new partnership for ELCA World Hunger through our Hunger Education and Networking grants, and that's with Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary. They recently opened their Center for Climate Justice and Faith, and they're launching certificate programs and continuing ed opportunities for non-degree seeking students, for folks who are lay people, for rostered leaders, for young people, for retirees, for people of all walks of life, not only within the ELCA, but also within the larger community, both in our ecumenical partners and in our companion churches through the Lutheran World Federation. We're super excited to be partners with them. So I encourage you to check out some of the things that they have on offer. There will be more programs coming out in the coming months, in the coming years. They're launching their first certificate cohort of students in August. So that's really exciting, a way of drawing those links between justice, climate, and faith. If you want to learn more about some of the things that we're doing, you want to connect with us afterwards, I put up our blog link here. Maybe Brooke can put it in the chat as well as how to find us on Facebook. Those are the places that where we post most of our updates, and kind of the quickest way to learn what kinds of things are going on with the programs and ministries that ELCA World Hunger supports, and to get in touch with us. And of course, you can always feel free to email any of us. I put my email address there, or the easier one to remember is hunger@elca.org, which our colleague Petra, who's actually on this call, monitors and can respond to there. Thank you very much for your time. I look forward to your questions and look forward to the ways that we might move from this space here into the future to really make an impact for our community and the communities we accompany around the world. Now I'll turn it over to Brooke. Were there questions that came up in the chat?
No, I don't have any questions in the chat yet, but if you have questions for Ryan, feel free to send them to the chat.
Or you can just shout them out too.
Or yeah, you can unmute yourself. We're done. Yeah, I think Ryan's in the PowerPoint.
Thank you very much. That was really powerful. As you were talking and showing the pictures, especially of the indigenous peoples, and then some of the statements you made about land and how it, shapes us and everything. I don't know a lot about it, but the sacredness and passion for land from indigenous peoples, I think we could all learn a lot from them. just from, the little studying I've done and knowing people. Because they just have a really, well, it's sacred, I think, to them.
Yeah, most definitely. I think that there's a lot to be learned there, not only from Indigenous communities, but from communities that we work with around the world about how different ways of conceiving relationship to land. Right. One of the things that we have to start, admitting, confessing to, as a church coming out of Europe, and as a church that was part of justifying colonial actions around the world, is confessing that our theology is part of this. A theology that believes that we are put on this earth to conquer it, and that God will bless our actions for doing that. It is a destructive way to approach our environment. And unfortunately, even as we've tried to move beyond that and to address the problems of climate change, we also need to address those underlying values that are inimical to the kinds of things we want to have done. We need a different kind of theology. We need a different understanding of our relationship to the land, and we need to listen to each other to learn new ways of relating and new ways of relationship. So some of that learning is also changing our values in terms of relearning how to respect where wisdom comes from, and finding new fonts of wisdom by opening ourselves up to other communities, especially communities that are most impacted by some of these events. So thanks for your comment.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so I see a question about what farmers in Michigan are experiencing. What are the changes in policy for which we can advocate? There's a lot that they're experiencing. So I mentioned the false springs, which are really, really hard for farmers, right? The very wet springs that we have, so they're trying to get crops out there. Like last year was corn. They couldn't get in until super late. Corn needs to get in by a certain amount of time. We need to be able to take advantage of that growing season. So they're experiencing that, right? The wetter fields. At the same time that you have wetter fields, you're having hotter summers, which are harder for livestock, which are harder for certain forms of plants, right? And increased amount of pests. So they're facing kind of all of these challenges. Now, the good news is they're adapting because, well, as we all know, farmers are really smart. They've been working that land for a long time. They know that land. And so they're finding ways to adapt, right? But they're also, according to one study from Michigan State University School Extension Program, they're also feeling blamed for climate change, which is one of the reasons that that many of them are reluctant to talk about it, because of much of the language about climate change we know is accusatory. And so they're feeling blamed. So the Michigan State's extension program found that one of the ways to correct that and to build better and stronger coalitions is to find ways to mitigate that kind of language and that sense of guilt and that sense of blame or accusation that goes within these conversations. So I think that that's one thing. In terms of policies for which we can advocate, policies that allow farmers the funding that they need to invest in the ways that they know they have to. Whether that is helping them to provide greater cooling or for cattle, irrigation systems, more sustainable methods of fertilizing, things like that. Policies that help them to invest in sustainable changes that they can make is one of them. But I think that a lot of it goes back to the first point that I made. Listen is the most important piece. Let's listen to what they're doing, because if we listen, we find out that they're already making a lot of the changes that they need to make. But thank you for that question.
There, if you scroll up, Ryan, there's another question above it, and looks like there's just another one that came in too.
What can be done to help congressional and corporate leaders view climate change as a justice issue? That's a good one. I think there are some that already do. And so for those that already do, thank them, to be honest, because they don't get a lot of thanks. Thank them, right? Some of the information I shared today was actually prepared by Debbie Stabenow's office. who's been a continuing champion for a lot of this work. Some of this happens by giving space to share and tell stories, right? What we as congregations, what we as people in communities of faith can do is create a space where our congressional leaders can hear stories from their constituents. If you're running a food pantry, if you're working with farmers in a rural community, invite them in to talk with and to hear from some of the participants in your ministry and some of the members in your congregation. Allow them to hear that, give them access to those spaces. That's one of the ways that we can be strong advocates in helping them see these as justice issues. And I think also lifting up the stories that we hear from communities like Shishmaref and from Ile de Jean Charles and from many of the other communities that are particularly at risk for climate-related shocks and the negative impacts of those. We need to learn more ourselves, and we need to be able to create spaces where those stories can be shared. And that goes back to one of the first things that we should do in any kind of activity like that, is building those relationships with communities so we can hear about them, right? I know in terms of environmental health in Detroit, one of the eye-opening things for me was experiencing what happened when there was a recent accident at a factory there in Detroit, which many of you probably didn't even hear about. It released toxic fumes into the air. Police were going around door to door, knocking on doors, telling people not to go outside because the air wasn't safe to breathe. But we didn't hear about it. We didn't hear about it across the state of Michigan. I only heard about it because I had friends in that area. As church, we need to recognize the power that we have to be a platform for other people's voices, to make sure that those stories can be heard and heard and heard again. But I think those are steps that we can take to helping those leaders see that and to helping hold them accountable. But it's continuing hard work, and it's a hard question to answer because many of them many of them and many of us, it's easier to not see it that way. And it's easier to see addressing climate change as an issue of shorter showers and not watering my lawn than it is of correcting some of the basic inequities that scar our world. Are there other questions? All right, well, we are almost at time here. I want to respect your time and that, but I want to thank you again for being here with us, for all the work that you're doing, for all the work that we're doing together as church together. And I will pass it on. I believe, who is doing the closing prayer? Is it going to be you, Lynn, or?
So this is John.
Passing on to John first, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to really abbreviate to my comments here, but I think the Synod, Ryan, as you know, passed 2 resolutions with really strong votes related to climate issues. One about plastics, the other one about fossil fuels and stuff. So one of the next steps for me would be to all the people that signed that, all of you, all the people that signed up for this, then is to really kind of own those documents because I think they have some potential power for us to take seriously to get things going in our congregations. Secondly, encourage congregations to form green teams. I know some of the people I'm looking at here tonight already have those, but to find folks that get at least portions of what you said, Ryan, but feel pretty alone in that. So to find 4 or 5 people and maybe across congregations in a community to do that, because that support is so incredible, I think, important. And then one of the things in our document is to be bearers of hope. And you mentioned that when I just hear it tonight, it's so easy to say, this is way too worse. This is awful. We're not going to get it. We're going to all be doomed. Versus the hope that we have because of Christ's death and resurrection and his presence in our own bodies and in our fellowships together. So to be bearers of hope and courageous witnesses in the midst of a pretty ominous picture that you, I think, painted for us tonight and examples like in Malawi, for example, where God is doing a new thing there. I wanted to also just pick up what many of you will hear on Sunday from the first reading in Lamentations. If you read the context and the verses in Lamentations, like it was really awful. People were dying, cannibalism, the babies would die and then they would eat the flesh. I mean, it's really, really terrible stuff. This was, and in the midst of that are these words, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in him. So I think we need, you talked about theology or spirituality. I think we're all going to need as disciples sort of a really daily reminder that God is still up to the new thing and restoration and reconciliation. We're going to need a really disciplined prayer life, I think, so that we don't give in to despair and cynicism. So those were some thoughts I thought about next steps. Abbreviating, I think I'm really excited about the toolkit, what's going at Pacific, the things that we look forward to. And maybe finally, agencies like Michigan Interfaith Power and Light, for example, can help us with advocacy, and the ELCA through World Hunger and also the Washington office. That seems to be like more than taking a shorter shower, you know, all that don't water your lawn, is to really become much better and courageous and adept at advocacy. So we all need help with that, but that probably is the biggest, maybe the most important thing that we can do as we hope in God. So those are my thoughts about some next steps we might all take. And then I'll turn it over now to Lynn.
Thank you, John. Let's bow our heads in prayer. Creator God, we thank you again for the opportunity to learn about your creation and how we as people can help sustain it. Motivate us to be advocates. Motivate us to be led by your Spirit, that we might find ways to help each other be true stewards of your creation. Motivate us with love for all people, so that everyone might have and live in a just society. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.